Okay. In Hopes and Prospects, you mentioned your colleague Kenneth Hale and his work with Native Americans. In your opinion, how important is the problem of language extinction? That is, how important is it for humanity to preserve the current level of linguistic diversity?
Well, Ken Hale was a friend of Ann's as well. The teacher was a fantastic linguist and person also. He worked extensively with indigenous languages all over the world. Australia, he was one of the founders of Australian linguistics, worked with Native American languages, Central American, African, and so on. He did really amazing work, but this particular aspect of his work was something that greatly concerned and interested him, trying to protect, and as he pointed out correctly, when a language disappears, a lot is lost. A language is a repository of cultural wealth. It's a way, this actually relates to what I was saying before, each language is a way of understanding and interpreting the world. It carries the wealth of tradition and history, oral history, which can be extremely rich. I mean, like say, takes the Bible, for example. For 1,000 years, that was oral history before anything was written down. Homer's oral history, and that's all over the world. We're losing those treasures every time a language disappears. And for the people themselves, they're losing their identity. If English disappeared, we would lose our cultural identity. And that's the same is true if it's a small group somewhere. Well, one of Ken's achievements in this regard, which was quite spectacular, was to take a language which was one of the major languages spoken right here before the colonists came. Remember, the United States is not an ordinary form of imperialism. The United States is a settler colonial society. In fact, that's true of the whole, what's called the Anglosphere, the countries that grew out of the of Britain's imperial domination. United States, Canada, Australia, mostly New Zealand. These are countries where the settlers who came in didn't just run the country the way the British did in India. You know, British in India provided the bureaucrats, the officer corps, and so on. But Indians ran the country under British rule. Settler colonial societies are different, like ours. If you go back to the founders of the country, like, say, George Washington, he understood very well that we have to, as he put it, extirpate the Iroquois. They're in our way. We have to wipe them out. They're an advanced civilization. They, in fact, were the basis for much of the American constitutional system. But we had to extirpate them. They're in our way. Thomas Jefferson said we have to exterminate the native populations because they're attacking us. And why are they attacking us? Well, because we're taking everything away from them. He didn't say that. But in general, the settler colonial societies have to pretty much exterminate the indigenous populations or else marginalize them. Well, that's happened here. So where we're sitting was a place where the indigenous population was close to exterminated, pretty close to it. There are survivors. One of the major languages spoken was Wampanoag. It hadn't been spoken for a century. The last speaker was a century ago. Ken and some students and a woman from the Wampanoag tribe, which still exists, Jessie Littledoe, managed to reconstruct the language using comparative evidence from other languages and missionary texts that were taken and preserved. And from this, they were able to reconstruct what the language must have been. And it now has its first native speaker, Jessie Littledoe's daughter, who's a native speaker of Wampanoag. This has revitalized the tribe. They're now studying it, they're reconstructing their history, they're reviving. It's a pretty amazing achievement. Jessie got her PhD with us, with Ken, in our department. It's the first time this has ever happened, I think, and now there are efforts to do it in other places. But if you could revive, I mean, right now there's enormous destruction going on. Species destruction, for example, is taking place at a level that hasn't happened for 65 million years, literally. The time when an asteroid hit the Earth, apparently, and wiped out the dinosaurs, and the majority of living species were destroyed. Mammals survived. That's why we're around. But right now, the same thing's happening. Species destruction is happening about at that level. And now we're the asteroid, of course. We're destroying the species at a massive rate. Language destruction is kind of a little like that at a cultural and human level. You're destroying the richness of human civilization and understanding of the world. It's disappearing fast. It's disappearing in Europe, not just in indigenous cultures. So if you go to, say, Italy, there are people all over the place who can't talk to their grandmothers. Their grandmothers speak a different language. They're called dialects, but they're actually different languages. The number of languages in Europe has contracted radically over recent years through the policies of state formation. When states are formed, formation of states is an extremely violent process. It imposes a rigid form on societies which bringing together people who have nothing to do with each other and separating people who have everything to do with each other. That's why Europe was the most savage place in the world for centuries, while the process of state formation was taking place. You look around the world today, and just about every major conflict is based on the imperial borders. Borders were imposed by the imperial powers for their own interests, forming states which have no significance for most of the people. So take, say, Pakistan and Afghanistan. We talk about terrorists crossing Pakistan to Afghanistan. Many of them are just Pashtun, moving from one part of Pashtun territory to another part of Pashtun territory, which is separated by a line that the British imposed, the Durand Line, which the Afghans have never accepted and the Pashtun have never accepted. That happens everywhere. President Obama, one of his achievements has been to break all records in deporting undocumented immigrants, almost 2 million. They're crossing a border, the Mexico-U.S. border, which, like state borders generally, was established by brutal violence and aggression. The U.S. conquered half of Mexico. President Grant described it as, who fought in it, described it as the most wicked war in history. Well, okay, that established a border. It was a pretty open border, the same kind of people living on both sides until pretty recently. It's been heavily militarized now, primarily since NAFTA. When NAFTA, the North American Trade Agreement, was instituted, President Clinton, his advisors, understood very well that this is going to devastate the Mexican economy, and it's going to destroy Mexican agriculture. It's going to undermine small business and so on. Mexican campesinos can be quite efficient, but they can't compete with highly subsidized U.S. agribusiness. So there's going to be a flow of immigrants, so we got to militarize the border to prevent them, send them back. Right now, to this day, right here near Boston, right around us, there are people fleeing from the Guatemalan highlands, Mayan Indians fleeing from the Guatemalan highlands. Their languages are also being destroyed. Why are they fleeing from the Guatemalan highlands? Well, under Ronald Reagan, the U.S. supported a genocidal attack on the highlands and the Mayan Indians by the military dictatorship we were backing in Guatemala. And the devastation was so extreme that they're still fleeing. Well, they're fleeing, we deport them. They're coming across from Mexico, we deport them. That's a state border. That's the way borders work. All over the world, that's the way it works. You take a look at the horror stories all over the world. Almost entirely the result of the imposition of state borders, which also has the consequence of wiping out lots of languages. When you impose a state border that constitutes, say, France or Italy or Germany or Guatemala or whatever it may be, or the United States for that matter, you're wiping out huge numbers of languages which are internal to them. Well, this is a kind of, it's not species destruction, but it's kind of analogous to us. And it's going on all the time. And the effort to save species, cultures, societies, languages is a major effort happening in Europe too. So right now there's a referendum coming up in Catalonia, another one in Scotland, asking about autonomy or independence. That's dissolving the European state system, something which has been going on for a while, and reconstructing the languages. Actually, I visited Barcelona in the late 70s. You couldn't hear a word of Catalan. It was spoken, but secret, because under the dictatorship, which the U.S. backed, it was barred. 10 years later, if you go to Catalonia, all you hear is Catalan. It revived. The Basque languages revived. Other regional languages are reviving. If you walk around Wales, kids walking out of school are talking Welsh. Things like this are happening. Ken's achievement was unique, but it's a kind of a natural development, I think, should be stimulated myself. But we should recognize that there's enormous loss when the cultural wealth of a society disappears. That's encapsulated crucially in its language.